Outbreak, Boston, by Robert Van Dusen. Chapter 1. 12 May, 2011. 21:35 hours, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Boston, Massachusetts. Senior Airman Amy Fraze woke with a yelp and looked around, thoroughly confused for a brief moment until she could get her bearings. Slight chill plus buzzing fluorescent lights that made you look like you had a pretty serious case of jaundice, plus dry air equaled the computer lab and physical science building. She was short with a lean, muscular frame, but the young woman was mid-deployment hot. Her hips were a little bit too wide, legs a little bit too short, just a shade too much muscle to be really attractive to most men, but after 3 months in the desert, she had been fighting the guys off with a stick. And she knew it, so she did not even really try. She dressed in faded Levi's and an old t-shirt most of the time. From a distance, someone observing her might think that she was wearing reddish-brown gloves until they got closer and saw that the skin of her hands, neck, and face had sunburned, then healed and sunburned again repeatedly. She turned her attention to what woke her, namely, the cell phone buzzing against her stomach in the front pocket of her hoodie. It was almost summertime, and it surely seemed like it outside to everybody else, but it felt kind of chilly to her. It had averaged well over 120 degrees in the shade when she left Iraq a month or so ago, so 65 took a little getting used to. She dug a chunk of something crusty out of the corner of her eye with one bronzed finger as she groped for her cell phone with the other. "Outstanding," she muttered quietly, sighed, and stabbed the green button on the screen of her smartphone with her index finger. "Hello, Lieutenant Anderson. How are you, sir?" She groaned and sighed, trying to hide her dislike for the man. Her Air Force Reserve section had come back from Camp Freedom, a little forward operating base with the airstrip just outside Mosul, a little bit over a month ago. She had completed Airman Leadership School before her deployment, but somebody somewhere down the line screwed up the paperwork holding up her promotion to Staff Sergeant, and she had a pretty good idea of who it was that might be responsible for the foul-up too. "Airman Fraze," the lieutenant began quickly. She imagined him, wherever he was, puffing up the self-importance as he spoke. "Call your points of contact, grab your battle rattle, and get to the airfield. Time, now!" The urgent tone of the man's voice instantly squashed any personal feelings against the man. The young woman put the phone on the table next to the keyboard and pressed the speaker button as she hurriedly saved what little work she had actually managed to get done before dozing off. "Roger that, sir. I have you on speakerphone," she answered, sparing a suspicious glance at the phone. "What's going on, sir?" A million bad scenarios ran through her head as she pulled some stray locks of chocolate-colored hair back into the bun on the back of her head. She could practically feel the sand crunching between her teeth. The man let out an exasperated chuff before he could stop himself. "Don't you watch the news, Airman?" he asked, clearly sounding upset with her. "You'll get a briefing when you get here. Get here. Now!" With that, the phone went dead on the desk next to her hand. She frowned and put it away, wondering what the heck she was missing anyways as she gathered her gear, then hustled out of the physical sciences building and into the humid night. It had been raining more or less constantly for the past 3 or 4 days, and the moisture still clung to the air. After the past 6 months in the desert, Fraze could not help but take some time away from her classwork to walk in the gentle drizzle and enjoy the feeling of it on her face. Jacob, her RA, went with her sometimes. There was also that epic game of ultimate frisbee that he had dragged her to that seemed to take up the better part of the afternoon. Now she could not afford the luxury and hurried across the quad, through the parking lot and up to her dorm. Fraze noticed that a lot of the dorm rooms and parking spaces were empty. It sounded like somebody had thrown a bottle at the far end of the parking lot, followed by a lot of yelling. Fraze crouched instinctively at the noise, looked around to ascertain the direction of the sound, then sprinted up the stairs to her dormitory. There was nobody sitting at the security desk in the foyer. She shook her head and hustled up to her dorm room on the 3rd floor, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Fraze jammed her keys in the lock, opened the door to her room, and ducked inside. She paused and stared at what was her roommate's side of the place, or rather, what was not there on her roommate's side of the place. The dresser drawers hung open, the closet empty with the doors half open. Thankfully, her closet was still closed and locked, and her dresser looked like it had just as she left it. When she returned to school a week after the welcome back ceremony, Fraze had found that her roommate Janice had apparently gotten some of their things confused and all mixed together. She crossed to the small communal television resting on the cheap pressed board TV stand and flicked it on. Fraze was not surprised to see that it was turned to the Fox News channel. Janice was active in the campus Republican Committee, and she was thrilled to have an Iraq war veteran as a roommate. Fraze, however, found herself somewhat less than ecstatic with the arrangement. While Janice and her yuppie scumbag gelhead friends were partying, eating everything in the fridge whether they paid for it or not, and making a mess of the place, Frey was too busy trying to catch up on her schoolwork to do more than sleep, work out at the gym for an hour or two, and hopefully grab a bite to eat in the dining room. Then there was the time that Janice's dumb jock boyfriend of the week blew up a 20-gallon-sized trash bag and popped it next to Frey's bunk while she was asleep. She had rolled out of bed and ran headfirst into the wall, trying, out of instinct, to make it to the cement shelter that had been outside of her Connex. Frey's wanted to slug Janice when she got mad because you can't take a joke. In retaliation, she had thrown Janice's laptop across the room as she stormed out instead of decking her. She took a bottle of water out of the small refrigerator, measured out some into a large trapple mug, and then set out about making some coffee. Frey's grumbled angrily when she saw that Janice had used up the last of her half and half and had put an empty carton back. At least there was still plenty of sugar in the plastic container on top of the fridge. As the coffee brewed, Frey's checked the butter container in the door of the fridge. "Huh!" she cried triumphantly. The little thief did not find her hidden cachet of flavored creamers that she had filched from the student union at breakfast yesterday and carefully squirreled away. The coffee maker sputtered and spat as it finished filling the carafe with that wonderful, hot, and life-giving stuff. Frey sat on her bed, blousing her boots and half listening to the talking head on the screen across the room. What she heard was not good. The newscaster was saying something about some new jumped-up meningitis bug or something, and she was not entirely sure that she wanted to hear the rest. It looked like the natives were getting restless. She recalled hearing rumors about something like that while on deployment, but it was in Asia or Africa or someplace. She had never given the scuttlebutt much credence because, well, while it was pretty common knowledge that they got censored versions of the news, there was not even a peep of it in her email or anything like that. They could not censor her private email and Facebook, could they? Either way, it did not make much of a difference. Neighborhoods on the south side of the city were currently on fire, and the TV kept showing her the same police car getting smashed up and by a bunch of people wielding bats and pipes. "Time to go," Frey muttered to herself as she flicked off the television and started toward the door. She slapped her beret on her head and studied her reflection in the mirror by the door to make sure that it was right. Frey frowned at herself, then slung her rucksack over her shoulder and picked up her duffel bag. She paused outside Jacob's door and knocked a couple of times, hoping to get to say goodbye, then hustled down to her little Ford Ranger pickup truck in the student parking lot, but he didn't answer. Frey frowned as she slung her gear into the bed of her truck and pulled away from the parking lot. Frey had made it off campus with reasonable ease, but Route 2A North was a mess. She had called the 8 people on her list 3 times each, which was easy to do since she had not moved in 38 minutes according to the clock on the truck's dashboard. She was not at all surprised to find that none of them answered and nobody seemed likely to call her back. Frey drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, her ears already ringing from the reaming that she was sure to get. She grumbled to herself and began absently flipping through radio stations, trying to find out more about whatever the heck she was probably going to be dealing with. The problem was that it didn't seem like there was that much to tell, but of course it didn't stop the talking heads from throwing wild speculations and half-baked sounding theories. Muslim extremists, Iranian agents, or good old-fashioned act of God seemed to be on the top 3. And to make matters worse, she realized that she had left her cup of coffee sitting on the top of the fridge back in her dorm room. She dug through the storage space in the truck's armrest, trying to find the connector for her MP3 player so that she could listen to something besides the exasperatingly repetitive news reports. The woman's hand closed around something instantly recognizable and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. She had picked up the habit while pulling guard duty or radio watch while on deployment, mainly as a way to kill time or stay awake while on guard duty. She had quit cold turkey the week before the flight back to the States, stashed the most lethal pack of Miami cigarettes in her truck before her parents could see, and had not even thought about them since. She frowned at the Arabic writing on the package. "Ah, the heck with it," Frey muttered as she thumbed open the pack and jammed one of the horribly stale cancer sticks into the corner of her mouth as she pulled into the breakdown lane. She made it a quarter mile or so down the road before she found what was causing the traffic jam. The shattered, smoking remains of what looked like 3 cars choked the 4 lanes of the expressway. A large man in a state trooper uniform loped over to her vehicle with an irate look on his face. "What the hell are you doing?" he growled, one hand going to the butt of his pistol holster on his belt. Fraze felt her gut tighten into big knots. "Didn't you see the goddamn signs?" He flung the hand not on his pistol angrily toward the flashing sign on the side of the highway just a few dozen yards away. "My flight got recalled, trooper," she said quickly as she pointed to her security force's armband on her bicep. She dug into her pocket and flashed her badge. "I gotta get to Hanscom Air Force Base right away. What's going on?" The policeman's scowl deepened even though Frey didn't think it was possible. "Go on, get out of here," he muttered as he waved her on. Frey's shakily released a breath that she did not realize she was holding as she motored away from the wreck. She had seen the look on that policeman's face before in the eyes of the grunts guarding the gates of the FOB and sometimes her fellow airmen. He was tired, scared, and frustrated, and looking to take it out on someone. Thankfully, the road was more or less clear the rest of the way to Hanscom Air Force Base. She felt something almost akin to relief as she showed the men guarding the gate her ID and got a wave inside of the perimeter. The encounter with the state police had left her wanting to be safe, or maybe safer would probably be a better term, with her fellow airmen. Fraze pulled into a parking space at the rear of a squat red brick building and muttered angrily under her breath. There was a loose gaggle of men and women in uniforms beginning to form into lines and columns perhaps 10 yards away from her truck, but it was perhaps a third of the size that it should have been. She jumped out of the vehicle, slammed the door of the truck, and ran over to where her flight should have been assembling. A man who vaguely resembled a refrigerator and ABUs scowled as she approached. She had been surprised to learn that he had played defense for 2 seasons with the Boston Bruins. Carl, her little brother, would not give her a moment's peace until she had gotten him to sign his rookie card, and had 8 combat deployments with a vehicle operations unit under his belt before coming to the reserves. Fraze thought that he looked like Steve Rogers, Captain America's alter ego, with his square jaw, blonde hair, cut, and bulging muscles. She had considered making a pass at him when she had first gotten to the unit until she learned that he was married with 2 kids 20 years her senior, and her flight sergeant. In the 3 years since then, their relationship had settled into one of friendship and mutual respect. "Glad that you finally made it, Fraze," the big man grumbled as Fraze fell to his left. "Did you call everybody else?" He glowered beneath the brim of his patrol cap. "Sorry, Sergeant," she answered quickly. "I called and left messages, but nobody answered." Fraze took a quick look around. There were maybe 30 or 40 airmen in formation where there should be 150, not counting the airmen currently on deployment. It doesn't look like they were the only ones. Master Sergeant Emery tapped the woman's elbow, drawing her attention back toward the front of the formation. Captain Forthy wandered awkwardly from the back exit of the building to stand before his airmen. The highest-ranking people available stepped forward to fill in for their missing superiors and called their flights to attention, then conducted roll call. There was an airman first class standing at the front of the other squadrons. Fraze bitterly shook her head. When that was done, Captain Forthy gave them the command to stand at ease. "As you have probably heard, the government has declared a state of emergency," said the captain as he slowly paced back and forth in front of the formation. "There is heavy rioting in South Boston, and the disturbance is spreading across the river and into the suburbs." The man stopped and turned his gaze dramatically toward the men and women before him. Fraze was not surprised to learn that the captain had been an amateur actor in his youth. She almost snickered when she realized that the man was trying to sound like George C. Scott in Patton. "We are to draw weapons and live ammunition. Personnel qualified with grenade launchers and shotguns are to draw less than lethal countermeasures," the captain said quickly as he continued pacing. "Charlie Flight, you'll be moving out by bus to a staging area west of the city where we will assist local law enforcement in restoring law and order to the area. You'll receive your assignment when we arrive. Now, let's get going." The response from Fraze and her fellow airmen was probably not as enthusiastic as their captain wanted, but they still filed into the armory and began to draw their weapons and other supplies. Fraze hustled out to her truck and grabbed her gear before signing out her M4A1 carbine with underslung M203 44mm grenade launcher as well as her M9 pistol. The young woman put a fresh battery in her carbine's aim-point red dot sight with a 3x magnification module and made sure that she had a couple spare batteries not only for the sight but also the illuminator clamped onto the weapon's handguard. She shrugged into her body armor and buckled the pistol belt to her LCS as Sergeant Emery approached, already decked out in his own field gear. She felt a little underdressed when she first stood next to him, as the big sergeant carried not only a full complement of gear, but a 6-shot 12-gauge Mossberg 59 pistol, grip-pumped action shotgun, and a scabbard on the back panel of his LCS with 19 spare rounds of ammunition for it on each shoulder strap. Her only additions to her basic issue kit were the Black Hawk Serpa drop-leg holsters on her right thigh, a birthday gift from her parents, as her unit's standard issue drop-leg holster had a flap, making drawing the pistol a huge pain when you really needed it, a St. Joanne's medal from Father Greg, her hometown priest, and a combat lifesaver kit on the left side of her LCS. The man awkwardly held the handle of the 2 ammunition cans in each hand. Fraze took 2 of them, cracked the lead wire seals with her multi-tool, and tugged open the cans. The 2 of them made nervous small talk as they pushed rounds into the magazines and stuffed them into carriers on their harnesses. Fraze went back to the arms room and signed out the rubberized canvas bandolier containing half a dozen CS grenades for her launcher, which she slung across her chest like some old-timey outlaw. Sergeant Emery and Fraze went into the office to fill their camelbacks and canteens from the water cooler. Once they had their water, Sergeant Emery did a hands-on check of her gear, and the 2 of them went out the back door to wait for the bus. Fraze immediately started to loathe herself for having those 2 cigarettes on the way in. An itching, crawling sensation climbed up and down her spine when it wasn't busy running laps and doing backflips inside of her skull. It did not help that about a dozen of her fellow airmen stood around in loose groups with thin blue clouds of tobacco smoke drifting up into the sky. Sergeant Emery was by her side. "You know, I almost thought that we were going to go back to the sandbox," he said as he pulled a pack of Marlboro cigarettes out of an old ammo pouch on his LCS. He offered one to his subordinate, who accepted it with grateful resignation. He lit hers, then his with a silver Zippo, before snapping the lighter shut with a flourish. "Somehow, this seems a lot worse." "I know," Frey said quietly as she exhaled a plume of smoke. A look of alarm passed over her face as she dug out her cell phone. "God damn it. I need to call my parents and let them know what's going on." The big NCO smiled at the surprised and ashamed expression on his subordinate's face. Fraze was a 2-Mass-a-week Catholic and was mortified whenever she let the occasional cuss word slip. Sergeant Emery nodded and moved off to talk to some of the other NCOs as Fraze scrolled through the contacts list on her phone. She pressed a couple of buttons and the phone started to ring. Fraze nervously tapped her toe as she waited for someone to pick up. "Hey, kiddo," said a rough, masculine voice. Fraze's father smoked 2 packs a day, and it showed in his voice. She could tell that he was worried, but he was trying to sound upbeat. "What's shakin'?" "Hi, Dad. Just calling to let you know that I got recalled," she answered quickly. The headlights of the buses to take them to the staging area came into view at the other end of the parking lot. She frowned at the driver, willing him to give her 2 more minutes. "Listen, Dad, why don't you take Mom and Carl up to camp for a little while?" She could not hear her father's response because the buses had pulled up right in front of her, and the airmen began crowding onto each of them. "Dad, I gotta go. Tell everybody not to worry. I love them, and I'll see everybody soon." She hung up and stuck the phone back into her pocket as she boarded the rear bus. Fraze could not help but feel as she wasted her breath telling her parents not to worry. Her dad, who had served as a tank commander in the Marine Corps during Desert Storm, would act like he was not worried, even though he was. Mom would most likely bawl her eyes out like she did when her flight got on the plane for Iraq. Carl, of course, would probably wonder what they were so bothered about. She had a Brian F. and Emery watching her back, after all. Fraze plopped into the seat next to Sergeant Emery, her rucksack on her lap. Captain Forsyth clomped up the stairs to the bus and stood next to the driver. "I need 2 volunteers to drive a Humvee," he said loudly, his voice barely audible over the din of the airmen getting settled in for the ride. Fraze shrunk behind the seat in front of her and lifted her rucksack in an attempt to hide from what she knew was coming. "All right, Airman Jacobson and, the man surveyed the airman in front of him. "Airman Fraze, get over to the motor pool and sign out Bravo 3-4. Fraze bit back a groan. The bus seats were way more comfortable than the Humvee, not to mention the fact that the bus had air conditioning and it was easily a very muggy 90 degrees or more outside. Fraze also was not fond of the idea of spending the next couple of hours trapped in a vehicle with Airman Nick Jacobson either. He was short with bad skin and just on the edge of being jumped up over his weight, not to mention the way that he sometimes looked at the female personnel when the unit got together for PT and stuff made her skin crawl. It reminded her a little too much of the way the male personnel would stare at the females in the chow hall at good old Camp Freedom. The detail disembarked, pulled their gear out of the bus's cargo hold, and took off at a trot toward the high fence surrounding the motor pool. A couple of airmen from the base security section opened the gate to the motor pool and held it open for them while they got to the Humvee ready to go. Fraze opened the door and unlocked the chain, securing the vehicle's steering wheel. She pulled the sling of her M4 over her head and snapped the weapon in the rack next to the driver's seat. Airman Jacobson tossed his rucksack onto the back seat and secured his weapon as well. Fraze programmed the radio mounted to the Humvee's dash, then picked up the handset and keyed the mic. Any station this net, this is Bravo 3-4, radio check, she said quickly as she flicked the switches to turn the vehicle's motor over. This is Bravo 1 actual, said Captain Forsey, the man's voice rendered somewhat tinny and distorted by the radio speaker. Read the line with Charlie, Bravo 3-4. Roger that, Bravo 1 actual, Fraze said as the Humvee roared to life and she flicked on the headlights. We're ready to roll. 10 minutes later, the convoy of buses, Humvees, and 5 tons was headed east down the interstate toward the staging area. Fraze occasionally spared a glance at the young man sitting next to her. He looked pale and frightened, like a little scared boy. She suddenly remembered that he had joined the unit after she had gotten back and started to feel like kind of a jerk for her harsh opinion of the guy. This was his first deployment, and it might just be in his backyard. She felt around under the radio mount until her fingers found what she was looking for, a thin black wire with the male end of the audio jack on the end. Hey, Jacobson, you got an iPod or something? She asked, holding up the wire so that he could see it. Hook it into this headphone jack. Jacobson looked a little confused. What? He asked, arching an eyebrow at the woman seated next to him. Won't we get in trouble? Fraze laughed. If Captain Forsyth wants to jam us up, I'll rip out the same set I put in his Humvee. She turned her attention back to the road in front of her. Go ahead, man. It's fine. Pretty soon, the two of them were cruising down the road with the gentle strains of some kind of German speed metal band that sounded to Fraze like someone put a microphone in a sack full of sick cats, then started swinging it around their heads and recorded the noises that it made, screaming at them out of the Humvee's speakers. This improved Jacobson's mood greatly, however, and he even started talking more. In fact, he turned out to be a regular chatterbox, and he started grilling her about her previous deployment. Fraze told him all that she felt comfortable with and gently redirected the conversation when he started to get too close to something that she felt was better left alone. The radio squawked, thankfully cutting the music. This is Bravo 1 actual. There's a rest stop 2 miles up ahead, said Captain Forsyth. He paused and keyed his mic again. The Dunkin' Donuts is donating coffee and donuts to emergency service personnel. We're taking a 20-minute latrine break. How, copy? Several jubilant cries went up over the radio as the convoy pulled into the rest stop. Fraze grabbed her weapon and hurried in as dignified manner as she could toward the ladies' room while Jacobson made a beeline for the Dunkin' Donuts. When she came out and walked back to the vehicle, the younger man pressed a large cup of black coffee into her hand. Check it out, Fraze, he said, holding up a paper-board box with a proud smile. I've scored us 6 fried cakes and a bunch of donut holes. She looked quickly over both shoulders and flashed Jacobson a quick grin. Good deal, Fraze said as she led the way back to their vehicle. Keep those out of sight until we're moving again. Fraze stopped a few paces from the Humvee, a yawn slowly building in her chest. Would you mind driving? She asked as she covered her mouth with a fist and yawned. Jacobson grinned like a kid. Sure, he said quickly. I just finished up driver's training. Fraze could not help but smile nervously at the young man's enthusiasm. Just be careful, okay? Jacobson seemed like a good guy, but she could not help but wonder if she was making a mistake as she stowed her weapon and climbed into the passenger seat. Sergeant Emery approached their Humvee with 2 plastic bags in each hand that were full almost to the point of bursting. Hey, Fraze, he said as he handed her one of the bags through the window. A little present for Maria. Merry Christmas, guys. The two of them thanked him as he hurried back to the bus. They divided up the bottles of soda, cans of Red Bull, and snack cakes while they waited for the convoy to get ready to leave again. Fraze grumbled under her breath as she discovered her flight sergeant's other present, a carton of Marlboro Red Pack 100s. He even thoughtfully included a couple big lighters. "He knows that I've been trying to quit," she cried, holding the cigarettes up for Jacobson's inspection. Fraze sighed glumly and ripped open the box and took out a pack and jammed it into her cargo pocket. "No thanks," Jacobson said when Fraze offered him a pack. She frowned and put it back. "Figures he doesn't smoke," Fraze thought sourly as she pulled her rucksack off of her back seat and put the cigarettes inside. The man laughed at the sour look on her face. "He's just looking out for you," he said as he fired up the vehicle's engine. "Besides, you picked a hell of a time to quit smoking," he added in a perfect impression of Robert Stack from the movie Airplane. Fraze snorted a tiny laugh in spite of herself. Maybe 10 minutes after they were down the road, Fraze found that she was having trouble keeping her eyes open. A few seconds after that, she was snoring contentedly, the paper cup still clutched in her hand. Jacobson watched her out of the corner of his eye. The peaceful look on her face brought an uncomfortable stirring sensation in his groin. He quickly gulped down his coffee and threw the paper cup out the window. Jacobson hesitated for a moment, then reached across Fraze's lap and took her coffee. He allowed his fingertips to brush against her left thigh, the soft skin of her wrist, before returning to his side of the vehicle. The woman mumbled something under her breath and shifted around in her seat a couple of times before falling back to sleep. It was still dark when she opened her eyes. Fraze groaned and stretched, then checked her watch. She blinked at the number on the watch's face, trying to make them make sense. "Wakey, wakey, sleepyhead," Jacobson said, his voice rising and falling in an annoying sing-song manner. "I saved your coffee for you, but it's been cold for at least an hour." He held the cup up to her. "You want it?" Frey waved it away and grimaced in disgust at the man chugging the bitter black liquid. "Any of those donuts left?" Jacobson handed her the box, and she was surprised to find the box mostly full. She picked out a handful of chocolate-covered donut holes. Jacobson turned the volume on his iPad up a few notches. "Go ahead and eat them if you want those donuts," he said when Fraze put the box back in between their seats. "I don't need 'em," the airman added as he gave his middle a pat. They rode in silence for a few minutes. "Good thing you woke up when you did," Jacobson said quickly. "We're almost there." He licked his lips nervously. Nobody showed up from my flight. Do you think that we'll end up together? Working, I mean." Fraze laughed quietly. "I don't know. We'll have to see," she answered. There was something in the young man's tone that made her a little nervous for some reason that she could not quite put her finger on. "It's not up to me anyway. That would probably be up to Sergeant Emery." Jacobson looked more than a little crestfallen. "I'll see what I can do," Fraze added quickly, drawing a grin to the young man's face. "Sergeant Emery likes me." Their convoy pulled up to the gate of some sports stadium Frey had never heard of, but then she reflected that she never really followed sports all that much. Policemen decked up in riot gear waved the buses and other vehicles inside the perimeter before closing the gate behind them. The woman's heart settled in an uncomfortable region somewhere around her ankles. The sight that greeted their eyes was something Fraze never expected to see in an American city. Hundreds of people lay on stretchers, swathed in bloody bandages, while medics hurried in between them. Dozens of heavily armed soldiers and policemen trundled off in trucks and Humvees. There were even a few strikers, the latest and greatest thing in armor personnel carriers, which Fraze guessed probably came from an Army Reserve or National Guard unit, or so she found herself hoping. The APCs could shrug off just about anything the Iraqi insurgents could throw at them, so she found their presence simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Following Captain Forsyth's orders, Jacobson steered their vehicle into an empty space in the parking lot. "This is Bravo 1 Actual," said Captain Forsyth. Fraze looked around and saw the unit commander's Humvee perhaps 100 meters away. "Flight leaders, NCOs, and acting NCOs, there's a briefing at my Humvee in 30 Mike, where you'll get your assignments. Everybody else, hang tight by your vehicles." Fraze and Jacobson stood near their vehicle, watching Forsyth move off toward the boxy command trailer that bristled with antenna and satellite dishes. A couple awkward minutes passed. Wait here. I'll be right back, Frey said as she ambled off in search of her flight sergeant. She found him talking with a couple other NCOs as Frey's hovered near the edge of the conversation, waiting for an appropriate time to pull her flight sergeant away. Hey, Sergeant Emery, Frey's called as soon as the chance presented itself. Can I talk to you for a minute? Once the two of them were away from the others, Frey took a deep breath. Jacobson wanted me to ask if he can ride with us, she said quickly. Frey paused for a second, studying her flight sergeant's face. He seems like he's all right, but he's new. Sergeant Emery mulled the subject over for a few minutes. I saw that there wasn't anybody from his flight here, he half mumbled, scratching the stubble on his chins as he thought. He frowned, wishing that he had time to shave. The stubble was itchy. I trust your judgment, Frey. If you think he's all right and nobody else calls dibs and he can ride with us. A sick feeling rolled around in her stomach. Where is everybody? Frey asked quietly. She felt her forehead and cheeks suddenly feeling hot despite the slight breeze blowing in from the ocean. Don't they know that we need them here? She lashed out angrily, sending an empty soda can near the toe of her boot flying across the parking lot where it landed with a hollow rattle. What the heck is wrong with them? Once the storm had subsided, Sergeant Emery grabbed the woman's shoulders. Look at me, he said sternly. Frey glanced at her boots, at his. Look at me, airman, the sergeant repeated himself, this time turning the statement into an order. I need you here. Jacobson needs you here. Don't worry about what those fucktards are doing. We'll get this wrapped up, and the chain of command will handle it. Roger? Frey smiled, feeling her game face coming back. Roger that, Sergeant, she said quietly as she composed herself. Sorry. This is just... it's so out there, you know? Sergeant Emery laughed and clapped his subordinate on the back. It's strange, I'll give you that, he said as the two of them walked back toward their vehicles. It's about time for a briefing. I'll update you and Jacobson when it's done. Jacobson waited for her, almost like an expectant puppy, happy that his person came home. Did you ask him? The young airman asked. Frey could almost swear that he was actually trying to restrain himself from hopping on one foot to the other. What did he say? He said if nobody calls dibs on you from your flight, then you can ride with us, she said carefully. Unthinking, Frey dug her cigarettes out of her cargo pocket and tore open the cellophane. Before she could produce her lighter, Jacobson had his out and the lighter's small flame flickering. She muttered a thanks as he lit her cancer stick. Another awkward silence threatened the two of them as they watched the police and soldiers mobilizing around their staging area. I thought you didn't smoke, Frey said at last. She field-stripped the butt of her cigarette and dropped the filter into the cargo pocket of her ABUs. They went to the back of the Humvee and pulled out their vehicle's crews-served weapons, a Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine gun. There's a lot you don't know about me, Jacobson said with a raised eyebrow, drawing a chuckle from the young woman next to him as he picked up the weapon's pintled mount. Though seriously, I don't. A lighter can be just a handy thing to have. A couple minutes later, Sergeant Emery left the briefing and approached their Humvee. All right, you crazy kids. Road trip, he cried, spreading a tactical map on the hood of the vehicle. Frey and Jacobson crowded around him and peered at the map. We're gonna go here, Sergeant Emery informed his subordinates. This right here is Scenic Checkpoint 12 on the north side of the Harvard Bridge. There we'll find about half a squad of Marines from the 1-8 Combat Engineer Battalion. He paused so that Frey and Jacobson could finish writing down what he was just told them. Our mission is to contain the civilian population on the south side of the bridge, Emery said, encircling the quarantine zones with a red grease pin on the map. Intel indicates that so far only a few civilians have approached the bridge, though command expects more to turn up eventually. Nobody crosses the bridge. Civilians are to return to their homes and stay there until told otherwise. Emery rubbed his jaw and added with a hint of unease. Some people might be too sick to understand directions. We may have to use lethal force to maintain the quarantine. Just keep your heads and don't do anything without orders unless you perceive a direct threat to yourself, friendly forces, or civilians. Clear? He paused a moment to see if the airmen had any questions and continued the briefing. When we get there, There's this jarhead lieutenant named Peterson in charge. We follow his orders unless we are different, come down from higher." Sergeant Emery let Fraze copy the marks that he made on his map on her own. "We're leaving in 10, so let's finish getting our 50 cal mounted and ready to go, kids." Jacobson rode shotgun while Fraze drove. Their truck was part of a 4-vehicle convoy of Army and Air Force Humvees moving from the staging area to their assigned sectors. Sergeant Emery rode in the gunner's cupola behind the Humvee's crew's served weapon. Once they were out of the staging area, much of Frey's secret annoyance, Jacobson's hooked his iPod back up and the German cat torturers were blaring once more. She was wondering when Sergeant Emery would get sick of it when he bent down into the vehicle and bellowed, "Turn that shit off!" The young man seemed to deflate a little as he complied. Fraze smiled into the palm of her hand. The few times they had to go outside to the wire on deployment, Sergeant Emery had her crank bad to the bone by George Thorogood and the destroyers on their way out of the gate. A half an hour of driving made Fraze think of downtown Mosul. Hundreds of cars crowded the street, people yelling at each other, car horns blaring. Many of the vehicles had luggage or other household goods strapped to the top. A few of them even had animal carriers, complete with panicked cats and dogs in them. "Any of this familiar to you, Sergeant?" Fraze said loudly so he could hear her over the street noises. "Kinda," shouted Sergeant Emery, "except there's more white people." The two of them laughed and then turned their full attention back to what they were doing. Jacobson chuckled nervously and began fiddling with his equipment as he stared out of the vehicle's windscreen. "Try to speed up a little. There's a guy in a blue sedan right side intersection next block. Looks like he might try to get in the middle of the convoy." Fraze stepped on the gas, keeping the car from cutting into traffic and screwing with the convoy. Sergeant Emery swung the 50 cal around and pointed it in the offending vehicle's general direction just in case. When they came to a stoplight, Fraze dug a Red Bull out of her rucksack, unfolded her knife blade from her multi-tool, and used it to shotgun the energy drink. "Relax, Jacobson," she said as she dropped the empty can into the plastic bag on the back of the man's seat. "It's gonna be all right. Just stay cool, buddy. We'll look after you." Fraze broke off from the convoy when they arrived at the checkpoint to find two other Humvees arranged in a wedge perhaps a quarter of the way across the bridge. There was a 5-ton truck blocking both lanes closer to their side of the bridge with a couple other Humvees arranged next to it. A short, beefy man in Marine Corps camo approached as Fraze steered the vehicle onto the bridge. "Hey, Marine," called Sergeant Emery. "Where do you want us?" "Fill up the gap on your right flank," said the Marine, gesturing toward where he wanted Fraze to park the Humvee. "Lieutenant Haskins wants us to go over the game plan with your squad leader once you're in position." Once the vehicle was stopped and Fraze had the parking brake in place, Emery dropped down into the cab. "Fraze, take over up there. Remember, we're on crowd control, so keep your M203 handy." The man opened the rear driver's side door and stepped out onto the street. "Jacobson, just try not to touch anything. I'll be back in a minute." Fraze climbed through the back door and into the copula. There was a dull roar of shouting and people angrily honking their car horns on the far side of the bridge. She could not imagine what it was like over there. The heat, choking on car exhaust, kids crying, hoping to outrun whatever this new hopped-up bug was that brought on this panic. That could very easily be her over there. Fraze shuddered at the thought. The crowd started across the bridge, perhaps pushed forward by the crush of people and vehicles behind them. Fraze braced herself and prepared to rip open the Velcro of her gas mask carrier and stuff her face into the stifling plastic and rubber mask. She hated wearing the thing, but it beat catching a lungful of CS gas by accident. Fraze crouched down inside of the vehicle. "Move over into the driver's seat and get ready to put on your gas mask," she told Jacobson. She stood back up and maneuvered her M4 into position and slid the breech of her grenade launcher open. "Just stay calm," Fraze added as she inserted the CS grenade into her launcher's chamber and pulled the action closed. Sergeant Emery came back to the Humvee on the run. "Wait for the green light from command," he said loudly. The man shaded his eyes and watched the mob coming toward them on the bridge. "They appear to be unarmed, so hold your—" The heavy, unmistakable bark of the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun cut him off. Fraze watched in horror as perhaps 24 people in front of the mob tumbled like bowling pins. Screams rent the morning air as the mob tried to disperse, but for the ones in front who were in the middle of the bridge, there was nowhere for them to go because the people behind them would not let them pass. In their panic, the civilians started shoving each other into the river and crushing one another underfoot. Fraze looked helplessly down at Sergeant Emery. "Gas 'em, Fraze!" he shouted, pointing furiously toward the terrified mob. "Gas 'em!" Fraze raised her M4 to her shoulder and prepared to fire at some people across the bridge who were not as unarmed as intel had indicated returned fire. A bullet whined off the Humvee as Fraze M203 thumped a grenade back at them. White smoke billowed, causing all nearby to choke and gag as the CS did its work. Fraze ducked down inside of the truck and tore open her mask carrier, preparing to strap on her gas mask. Her nose and eyes started to burn a little as the wind blew some of the gas inside of the vehicle. Sergeant Emery opened the rear driver's side door, digging out his own gas mask as he started trying to climb inside the vehicle. His face was perhaps a foot or so away from Fraze's own when it disappeared in red mist. A bullet seemed to have found the gap between the door and the body of the Humvee, turning the man's face into a dripping raw hamburger from the bridge of his nose down. Fraze leaped across the inside of the vehicle, caught the big sergeant's arms, and tried to haul him inside. The blaring of an air horn distracted her momentarily from her task. A large green dump truck smashed the smaller car out of its way, black-gray smoke billowing from its chrome exhaust pipes as its driver floored the accelerator. The huge truck seemed to take up the whole world as it came barreling toward their position. Fraze forgot about Sergeant Emery for a minute. She stared dumbly at the dump truck as it bore down on her, smashing everything before it to a pulp. Bodies flew through the air like rag dolls, blood glinting red on its shiny chrome bumper as a handful of 50 cal rounds peppered the truck from punching spiderwebs into its windshield. There was time for only one last thought before the massive vehicle crashed into the Humvee. This is it. I'm gonna die.